First question that I was going to ask is if you could tell us a little bit about how you got started with building culture and then how that led to you creating Townsend.
I have to go back just a little ways to do that because I started my career as an accountant at a Big Four accounting firm in Houston.
Oh, really?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that was 2011, and right before I took that job in college, I told you right before we got on here, I grew up in the suburbs of Houston, and I had a 3-month break before I started my job, and so I went backpacking around Spain and Portugal for 3 months by myself. And I knew nothing about architecture going into that, had no background in it, and it was then that I'm just kind of looking around going, oh my gosh, like this is incredible. There's just beauty everywhere, the lifestyle that it enables. What's different about it? Why is it different? Why don't we build like this anymore? So that was my first kind of like question mark moment. Because when you grow up in something, you just assume that that's how it's supposed to be. You're in America. America's great. And so that led me down the path of reading Suburban Nation and Christopher Alexander and Jane Jacobs and kind of all those things back in, I don't know, over a decade ago. And realized I really wanted to be a part of the solution to these problems because having grown up in the suburbs, I could really see how the built environment shapes your everyday life, that it really is the human habitat. And we've built a really crappy human habitat across much of the United States over the past 100 years. So I wanted to get into development because developers really shape what happens, but I didn't just want to do it like from a spreadsheet, if that makes sense. So I ended up apprenticing under a master mason who was doing these incredible brick buildings. So I did that for 2 years, and that's how I really got stepped into this, is starting as a brick mason, learning how to build, teaching myself design, and then in 2017 I launched Building Culture and really was running it as a design and build company across custom homes, small spec houses, and commercial buildings. We got more into designing walkable neighborhoods and a couple small developments, and then now with Townsend, as you've mentioned, we're kind of stepping into what I've always envisioned for Building Culture, which is this vertically integrated real estate developer that's in-house architecture and design, in-house construction, GC, general contracting, and the actual developer that's putting the deal together, syndicating, and actually controlling it all. So that way you can really create something truly unique.
Yeah. So Building Culture is a one-stop shop. Like it's taking care of essentially the whole process for Townsend, right?
100%. Yep.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I find it interesting that you said that the way you got interested was seeing things in Spain, because like you mentioned, I grew up in the Chicago suburbs as well. And it's just like the normal thing to want to drive everywhere. That's what you're used to. And then when you move somewhere else and you kind of have this eye-opening revelation, you're like, oh, people are living in a completely different world. And it is super interesting.
It is. Yeah. Seeing a compelling alternative is better than any words can do, you know?
Yeah. And so within Townsend, we saw there's another project you're working on called Apollo Workspace, which we really liked in the sense that it promotes community development and getting people to know each other. I saw that there's even a sauna, cold plunge for the members. So yeah, if you could also talk a little bit about that, that would be good.
Yeah, we're probably, if we were in New York, we'd be behind on everything. But in Oklahoma City, I think we're probably pretty ahead, putting saunas and cold plunges in. But the funny thing is, the reason we were already, vertically integrated on kind of the development, the hardware side, the building and all of that. But what I've discovered as we put this deal together, as you just mentioned, like having these community aspects is really important to a successful project and really important to me. And I found that I couldn't get the people to operate it how I wanted to operate, or couldn't even get anyone to operate it at all. And so I realized, well, we're just going to have to do it ourselves. No one's going to do it how we want it done. And kind of take this, I've really been inspired in a lot of ways by Apple over the years, not so much now, more like in the past, where they really were passionate about starting with the user experience and then backing into the hardware and really being insistent that they had to control both the hardware and the software for an integrated experience. And so that's really what we're doing with Apollo. It's like we've come up with a concept about how we want working there to be like. We've designed it that way, we're constructing it that way, and then we're going to operate it that way very intentionally, from the way lights are done and windows in every office, the saunas and cold plunge, and running events, and really being just hands-on and creating a great place. And I think it'll also maximize the value of the real estate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I never thought about it that way, that Apple is one of the only companies that is control the software and the hardware end, with Mac OS is exclusive to Apple on the computers, and then there's also iOS, for mobile and all that. So I guess the idea is to replicate that within the town, right?
Yeah, something like that, where it's like if
Yeah.
you're just building the hardware and then leaving the software up to chance,
Yeah.
like what's going to happen? You don't know. Will someone come and actually develop the software the way you want it? And so it's like, well, let's
Yeah.
just do it ourselves. So I'm
That's
really
awesome.
looking forward to it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And we noticed that on the website, you talk a lot about community living, walkability, quality work, and proper architecture development. So I guess how do you believe these values impact the communities and the people living within it?
I think walkability is so, like a lot of people use the word density,
Mm-hmm.
but and sometimes walkability requires some level of density, but just density on its own is not a good neighborhood. Like if you're in downtown Dallas, there's a bunch of massive buildings in downtown where the density technically is high, it's more offices, but let's just say they were all even apartments. It would be a horrible living experience because there's still no walkability. There's just these massive streets in between. There's no one on the sidewalks. There's nothing to walk to. And so for us, it's about creating a neighborhood, not just walkability. To be walkable, you have to have something you want to walk to. It needs to be
Yeah.
beautiful. You need people in the community. You need local businesses. You need different types of housing. So we can't solve all of those problems with one little 1 acre neighborhood. We've got 18
Right.
townhomes, 2 live works, and 13,000 square feet of this commercial mixed use building. But the way I think about it, when you have that large of an acreage, and what I'm calling walkable is going to be different than what you call walkable in New York
Yeah.
City. But in this little, kind of growing walkable district in downtown, in the Oklahoma City metro. And
Mm-hmm.
so within a 10-minute walk, there's 35 plus food and beverage options within a 10-minute walk of our little neighborhood. So we really think about creating a coherent neighborhood with its own identity and feeling within a larger neighborhood. And then your daily life, are you still going to have to get in a car to go to certain things, schools,
Yeah.
because we don't have all the things set up around this? Yes, but if you can live more of your life in this kind of smaller radius, it gets so much more fun. You're outside more, you see people, you interact with the local barista rather than going through the Starbucks
Yeah.
drive-through. There's so many opportunities for that, and I've experienced it firsthand, one, from living in the suburbs, but two, from living in a walkable neighborhood for 6 years now, where
Mm-hmm.
there's not even that many restaurant options, but there's parks, there's playgrounds, there are restaurants and things, and we spend so much more time here interacting. When these small interactions, people say they don't like small talk, but that's like at networking events and stuff. Small talk is like an amazing way to just have this
Yeah.
really loose community when you're ordering something and get to chit chat a little bit, and you see this person 3 times a week, 4 times a week for years on end. Like that's really cool. And
Yeah.
I think that's really what community is. It's not a bunch of best friends. We only have a small capacity for best friends. It's really all these loose interactions where you actually feel like you are part of a place and
Mm-hmm.
feel participatory.
Yeah. I actually had like that last point you were touching on. I had a really similar experience that made me realize that recently, because there's on my street like a very local hole in the wall coffee shop that I go to every morning. And whenever I walk in, there's usually 2 employees, and it's literally just a counter. Like there's nothing there. It's the size of a closet. And the two employees, they always are willing to talk to you, and they like remember your names. And it's kind of like this community thing. And I was realizing it when I was back home. I went to like a Starbucks and I ordered coffee, and they're like, "Hey, how are you?" And I was like, "Good." And then I waited for them to say something, and they're like just waiting for me to say what I'm going to order. But the people in the local shop will go ahead and actually talk with you before that. And I found that super interesting. And that really makes a huge difference.
It really does. It's kind of like shocking that those small things, and I think that's been designed out of American life across most of the United States, where that's like nearly impossible in most places.
Yeah.
At least, right, whether you're in Texas or Arizona or Georgia, there's just not many options to be able to have that kind of lifestyle. And so I really think about, what is your everyday experience like? We think in America, it's often about the big things, the vacation, the New Year's holiday, the Christmas holiday, that cruise you're going on.
Yeah.
But what's your everyday experience? Like literally every day. And that's really the quality of your life.
Yeah.
That 1 week of vacation is not going to make up for the other 350 days of the year.
Exactly. And then in terms of the small businesses, Angelo was talking a lot about this in Long Island City. Do you want to chime in on that, Angelo?
Yeah, I also wanted to ask another question about the school district. So when I was going through, I was looking up statistics for Oklahoma, and I found out that Edmond had one of the best school districts. Do you think that better quality education coupled with more walkable neighborhoods encourages people to move there, or is just increased development going to bring in more people and eventually build up amenities like schools, like hospitals around the walkable neighborhoods?
It's really interesting because it's like a chicken and an egg problem. But
Right.
I will say, like, the good schools are absolutely critical. It is such a big deal, and so much of the previously urban cities across the US, and particularly kind of like these Midwest cities and stuff, the urban cores have been hollowed out and people have moved to the suburbs. And then the schools have all died in the inner cities. And so all the good schools are out in the suburbs. And then no families will move down into the urban cores, even with these kind of revitalized and cool historic neighborhoods, because there aren't any schools. And so I see schools as absolutely critical, because if you don't have schools, you might be able to create a walkable district, but it's probably going to be like, and I'm kind of exaggerating a little bit here, but like a 6th Street in Austin, which is not a pleasant place to be now. It's just like, it's just a bunch of bars. It's just a bunch of single people. And there's nothing wrong with having single people there. But when it's only single people, because no one with a family can live there, you actually don't have that great of a place. I find that if you create a place that's for families, where families are comfortable and you can see kids out on the sidewalk, suddenly everyone is comfortable, and is great if you're single and live there too. And so I think schools are just so critical. But like I said, it's the chicken and egg problem in a lot of areas. It's one of the reasons we did choose downtown Edmond, because it is so appealing with the good schools. But at the same time, you need, some level of density and sales taxes or property taxes or whatever it is, however your school district's funded, to generate better schools.
Right.
So it's really hard in a lot of places.
I think there's something to be said for anchor buildings as well. We had an interview with a professor from our university a couple months ago, and he had mentioned how he worked in Long Island City, and the area was almost completely empty until anchor buildings like delis, restaurants, and even larger office spaces that had working professionals started coming in. If it's essentially an ecosystem, right? I mean, if you don't have everyone feeding into it and places for people to go, you could build whatever you want, but in reality, the community may still just be dead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of those anchor, um, places are really important, because it's how you start revitalizing a place. It might not be a perfectly walkable neighborhood, but now at least there's a reason to go there, or at least you might already be there and there's a reason to linger there. And,
Right.
and so then it can, build off itself.
Frida and I were at Long Island City, let's say a month or two ago, and we had gone around. We were looking to interview people and get some B-roll footage for videos on TikTok and Instagram. And walking around there, we realized there were only a couple of areas that actually had families walking around them. There was this little area by the water that had parks, it had restaurants, and a school a couple blocks away. And then you walk further in, and it's just completely a commuter hub. There's large apartment buildings. There's not really any local stores, just a bunch of chains. So, I mean, Fareed, if you want to just touch on that and talk about the experience we had.
Yeah. That place is it's like it's very dystopian, because you'll go like by the water and there's going to be people walking around. It's super lively. And then literally you walk 2, 3 blocks down and it's just these enormous towers, and at no stores. It's just tower, tower, tower. And there has to be thousands of people living in these towers, but you look around and there's literally no one, there's literally no one walking. It's the most absurd thing how it'll go from so alive to just completely dead in 2, 3 blocks. And I think that I genuinely think that that's a result of not having those anchor buildings that we were talking about, because there's less reason for foot traffic to go over there if it's just people living there, going to their job, and then commuting back, but not having offices, not having jobs there, not having food, and just the essentials.
Yeah, density alone, going back, kind of like the Dallas I was
Yeah,
describing, that's
exactly.
exactly, it's like density alone does not create a place, or does not create a human place or a neighborhood.
Exactly.
And y'all are in New York, and I don't mean that there should not be large buildings or something. At the
Yeah.
same time, and I think they can be used in the right places. And New York City is literally just, I mean, it is its own thing globally.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, I'm kind of like, you don't need to have skyscrapers. You can have 4 to 6 2 to 6 story buildings and have incredible urban fabric. Paris is 50,000 people a square mile, and it's like 5 stories. Amsterdam is 16,000 people a square mile, so much more gentle density compared to Paris. And so I think more applicable to much of the US in terms of some of these Midwest cities and things where it's townhome based and row home based, but it's still dense enough to have this incredibly vibrant street life, walkability, local restaurants, schools, things like that. And that's, 4 or 5 stories tall through most of the city.
Yeah. And that's something that we've been talking a lot about with Alicia, because she's a big advocate for that 4 to 6 story buildings within the courtyard, in the backyard. We think that's really interesting, especially because this middle has been almost zoned out of existence in recent years. At least in New York, you either see huge developments or the like low density houses in the suburbs. That's kind of the only things. And a lot of the 3 to 4 story buildings, they're illegal to build now. So we think that's an issue. And that's part of the reason why we were so interested in Townsend, because that kind of creates that missing middle, so to speak.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that it's been largely legislated away. But on top of that, because it's been legislated away, now that zoning laws and certain things are starting to change, and across not everywhere, and slower than I'd like, but it's still at least things are starting to move in the right direction in a lot of places. But now there's no small to medium developers anymore. You really have home builders that are good at doing really big subdivisions, and developers like land developers and kind of single family detached subdivisions. And then you've got large developers who do high rises, multifamily apartment buildings, industrial, self-storage. And that's really how real estate's funded now, through institutional capital and private equity, where to do a $10 to $30 million project, which once again, this would be more in New York City, but I mean, like in a lot of places, what we're doing at Townsend, you're going to be that $10 to $50 million development is kind of a sweet spot for missing middle housing and courtyard development. But who's going to do it? Because it's too hard for the big guys to do it. It's not big enough for the big guys, but then it's also really big. It's kind of like a home builder or something to take on a $10 to $50 million project. They're hard to get financed. So there's a lot of kind of obstacles in the way. We really need a lot more small to medium developers coming up in this next generation.
Yeah. And Angelo, that's what we had talked about with Reyes, with predatory landlords.
Yeah, yeah. I've seen this a lot in Astoria, actually. We've had a lot of houses, even just on my block and in the general area, being sold to larger companies. I know, like, the Teachers Association of America had their property manager buy up a bunch of houses, and now they're developing them into maybe 10 stories, 10-story buildings, no retail on the bottom. And these projects are mainly just a way to generate profit. Either they build them and they sell them, or they demand higher rents to give a required return to investors. And I think the lack of smaller landlords, responsible smaller landlords, is a real issue. They would typically own buildings, and they only charge rent as to what they need. They're not charging in excess. They don't have profit quotas to meet. And it's an issue for New York City because all the new developments are owned or ran by larger development firms who are essentially just pricing out smaller landlords and buying up a lot of real estate and not allowing room for actual quality developments, instead focusing on the cheapest means of producing the highest returning asset.
Yeah, I think it's an issue as and in multiple areas across the US, but as things become more centralized, and capital being one of those things, and it's kind of deployed from a very centralized, giant hedge funds and institutional investment firms, your community is a line item on a spreadsheet. Like, there is zero relationship. There is zero even care. And it's not because those people are bad. It's just because if you're allocating across the country, you've never been there, you have no relationships. It's literally you built something there because it made sense on an Excel spreadsheet. Like, you're going to think a lot differently than, as you just talked about local landlords, but not only local landlords, local investors.
Right.
And I think that's something that we've really lost, is a lot of real estate historically, or at least from my understanding, you've had a lot more local people funding the things. And so then you're funding something in your own community and you care about the quality. You want to be proud of it. Yes, you want to make money. You need a return. All of that. I think capitalism is good. But when things start becoming too centralized, it's actually not particular. Yeah, I think there's a lot of negative and unintended consequences from that.
I also just think it's a hard barrier to entry. I'm sure there are a lot of smaller investors who would love to get into real estate or real estate development, but the barriers to entry are so high, and like you said, even borrowing is just harder because maybe you're not meeting the minimum return requirements.
It is, yeah. It's funny how hard it is to be that small to medium.
Yeah. And there's like a moat. There's like a moat around it, and the center is trying to be that small to medium developer, but it's becoming more and more difficult. I remember one of the professors we talked to told us that he has people because okay, the interesting thing about New York is that the real estate prices they just go up and up and up and up and up, and it doesn't matter when you buy, it's still going to go up. So he has developers knocking on his door like weekly and offering him what's like big developers offering him like 2-3 times the market value of his home in
Wow.
cash because they just want to turn it into it's a townhome, so it's pretty big for New York, and he's had it for I don't know 20 years, and they want to turn it into like 4 to 5 different apartments and charge crazy amounts of rent for these small little apartments, and it's just so profitable for them to get that land regardless of how much they have to pay for it, and I thought that was insane.
Yeah, that's hard. It's a different beast there.
Yeah. And something that we noticed was, all right, I guess what I want to ask you about, since Townsend is so, it's essentially like a solution to the missing middle. What do you think are some of the biggest issues that these city developers gloss over when they're building towns that might not be, the skyscrapers, but just more of the medium to lower density?
Can you ask me what are they kind of missing when they go and do this?
Yeah, what do you think that they're missing? Yeah.
I've got a few examples of some things where I see someone try to do kind of the right thing, say like, and when I say the right thing, just they're trying to do something quality, they're trying to do something, say walkable. And if you're already in an amazing urban fabric and then you go and add 10 townhomes on a street or 5 townhomes on a street, that can work really well. But most of the US, the vast majority is not that, where there's not amazing urban fabric around, because if there was, it would be extremely expensive, as you just pointed out.
Yeah.
And so if you took our project and instead of arranging it, and I know we don't have it on screen, but instead of arranging it the way we did, you just kind of lined townhomes off the street and then the commercial was just a big building, it's walkable within a 10-minute walk to all these things, but like what's immediately adjacent to the street is not that nice. You'd be walking at your front door and it doesn't feel like a neighborhood. You're just kind of like, oh, I'm on this street. So we call it interblock development. And really, when you start to get 3/4 of an acre to an acre, you can start creating a place, like a real sense of place. And so I talk, there's all these interblock courtyards that you can wander through on an acre. And so when you walk out your front door, you walk into this courtyard and you might walk through a series of courtyards before you're out on a street. And so you've created this coherent place. When you're standing in it, you could be anywhere because we control what it looks and feels like, because, the buildings are, your placemaking. And so I think that's the biggest thing, because I've seen projects that are so close to being successful fail because they just line townhomes on a street and it doesn't feel like a neighborhood. And no one wants to live there, even though it's like kind of adjacent and near to things that you would want to live to. That's a problem that I see a lot. And then there's just not even people trying to do missing middle. Like once again, you've got the single family detached people do, and then it goes to multifamily apartment buildings, and there's just virtually nothing in between. And the regulatory hurdles to do it, even though it is starting to become possible, it's still so hard to do that I think the only people that can deal with the bureaucracy of it are the big people. But then why would they do that when they could just go build a big 300, 500 unit apartment building and do it faster and make more money? So you really have to have people that really care about it and are passionate about it. And that's the other thing where it comes back to capital, where I think we've been really upfront of what we're doing, why we're doing it. We've raised from 30 different individuals, $100,000 at a time. There's people in at different amounts. And these people in it, yes, it's an investment. They want to make money, but they believe in what we're doing.
Right.
And that's really important.
And I think that's what makes the biggest difference in the separation between a project that's made purely for profit and a project that's mutually beneficial to everyone, to the community, to the developer, to the investors, to everyone, because everyone is actually passionate about creating something and they know that it's going to better their community.
Absolutely. Like I really am I believe in capitalism. It doesn't mean there's not ways that it can go wrong. Ultimately, you still need good people doing good things. No matter what system you're in, you need good people doing good things. And I call it like regenerative architecture or regenerative real estate, where you yes, you make money because you have to make money to keep doing it, and you leave the community better by doing it, versus what I would call extractive real estate, where you are extracting as much as you can, and that's what happens a lot.
Yeah, I know that's something Angelo can talk about, because we were looking at, we obviously understand that there needs to be returns, and we need to, provide incentives for developers to make money, because we don't want them to, we know that it's unfair for them to ask, okay, create this city, but it's not going to generate you a big return. So we've been trying to investigate how we can encourage them economically to maybe have more tax write-offs or something like that to create some of these more sustainable developments.
Yeah, so recently I think the New York City Council, don't quote me on that, but the New York City Council passed a law that was buildings over 100 units had to pay higher tax, right? Now you have a flood of developers building buildings with only 99 units. So any laws that city councils pass just immediately impact the real estate market. They impact what developers want to build. But most of the time, these laws are often short-sighted, or they gloss over important details, and they just end up harming an ecosystem like New York City, where maybe 100 plus units is a good thing and something we want, whereas 99 units in Manhattan may not be enough to really build up the communities and keep them going. And I also had another question regarding public opinion, right? I know you had said you talk about this on Twitter a lot, and that's where we had found you. What were some negative reactions that you got? Because I'm sure there were some, either from the community, from the city, or just people who disagreed with your idea.
Thankfully, on Townsend, we didn't have any public backlash because it was essentially vacant land. There was like one old house on there that was vacant. So we didn't, and then there weren't like immediately a bunch of, nice house around it. It's by a park, it's by a grocery store, it's walkable, a bunch of things, but we didn't have like within our 300-foot radius, a bunch of people. It was already in CBD zoning, so central business district. So we weren't having to rezone. So yes, we had to get council approval on things, city council approval, but we weren't having to go and rezone it from a single family detached neighbor to something else. So there were a lot of positives there. Some difficult things we're still working, even though we had the zoning, was just working with the city staff at the time,
Right.
to do a more dense, complex, walkable thing, when that's just not what's been built over the, while all the stuff that is kind of walkable right there is all historic buildings that have been adaptive reused. So someone trying to do new stuff that doesn't meet, all the kind of standards, you have to work through the engineering department and the fire department and the trash department and the planning department, all of those things. And it's just difficult. We got there, and I think we built a lot of positive relationships, and I'm really looking forward to building it so people can, because I think a lot of people don't even really, they have no idea what we're actually building. I'm sure they're skeptical developers, and, oh yeah, you say you're going to do this, we'll see what you, well, we actually, like, our stuff looks better than it does in the rendering. So I'm really looking forward to building this, and for them to realize, like, oh, these guys are really serious about what they say.
Yeah.
I'll give you one counter example. This is not Townsend. It's a walkable neighborhood of 80 acres that we were master planning a little outside in a different adjacent city within the Oklahoma City metro. And I won't mention which one. We were recently, and this one you are having to do a PUD because it's just a vacant 80-acre tract of land where nothing's there. And so we're having to do a PUD and basically our own zoning. And boy, there were a packed room at planning commission, and every single person was a negative because they lived to the neighborhood to the north, which are on single family detached houses on, half acre, smaller, even lots. And we're not doing high density. This is like 4 units an acre or something like that.
Yeah.
It's mostly single family detached. There's some fourplex quads and stuff, and people were freaking out that there would be rental properties near their neighborhood, that people would have to drive through our neighborhood to get to their neighborhood because traffic was just going to be so backed up. And every excuse, like, we love the land just vacant and then we can just look out and see it, and it's kind of like, well, it's not your land. Like, it's not going to be vacant, and if we don't do this, I promise you what would come instead would be much worse. So that was, I wouldn't say it was disheartening, because it's also to be expected in a lot of ways, but it is kind of like, wow, it is an uphill battle in a lot of ways if you're building anything.
Yeah. I think that mentality has also prevented a lot of really good and positive developments for communities. I know like there's all this NIMBY versus YIMBY stuff on X. I'm not sure if you've heard, but it's like not in my backyard versus yes in my backyard. And there was like these huge discourses, and I think there's issues to both sides to some degree because obviously NIMBY is going to prevent a lot of developments from happening that would be beneficial, and then YIMBY will also sometimes advocate for just complete no zoning rules that allow you to build whatever, especially in New York, like just huge skyscrapers like we were talking about earlier, and neglect over some of the more walkable and smaller cities like Townsend. Yeah.
I completely agree with that, and one of the things on the NIMBY thing is, it's amazing how powerful city councils are. Like, people don't realize that city councilors of your city probably affect your daily life in many ways more than the state or federal government.
Yeah.
But it's just like 5, 9 people, whatever. You don't even know who they are. You don't know you can write them. You don't know you should go to planning or, city council meetings. Everyone's busy. And these are just normal people that probably have jobs because these things don't really pay. They're not going to be experts on neighborhood building, development, urban design, because maybe one of them is, but like to get a city council full of them would be nearly unheard of. And when you get 10 people in the room, 20 people in the room, 50 people in the room, 100 people in the room upset and yelling at you about how you're going to destroy their livelihoods and city, it's really scary to just be a person. You really have to have a lot of conviction to vote yes in spite of that. But guess what? There's not 100 people showing up being like, we should do this. It's like the developer and their little scraggly crew of people they brought along. Even if the entire city is like, yes, we should do this, no one's there to say that. And 50 angry people can sound really scary. And if you don't really have the knowledge to say, I understand these people are scared, whatever it is, but we need to do this for the good of the city. If you don't have the really like foundation to be able to make that kind of courageous decision, because you are going to make people mad, you're not going to make it. You're going to say no. And that happens all the time. And so I think that's how projects get killed. 50 people yelling at you is pretty scary.
Angelo, tell them about the bike lane incident.
Oh, okay. One of the first things we did, we were focusing on zoning and just community issues in Astoria. That was how we first started out. And the first city council meeting that we went to was an argument over a proposed bike lane on a major avenue. And there were some 100 odd people who had showed up with signs, just screaming, yelling, and finding every possible reason they could to basically get this bike lane project removed. And it looked like it was going to work, but I guess the city council stood firm, and they're actually starting painting the street right now. But just seeing how that amount of people with such organization can make such a difference is insane. And I wanted to follow this up with the question, how do you think organizations like ours and similar urbanist movements can actually impact urban planning and city council decisions? Because it's so hard, like you said, to rally against communities that are, well, not necessarily against communities, but to rally against a group of people who are so convicted in their beliefs and standing so firm.
Yeah, I think what excites me about kind of the time of life that we're living in and kind of the trajectory of the rest of my life, I'm 37, so I'm kind of going like, all right, I got like hopefully 40 more good years of work, and what can I accomplish in that? And I feel like we're at an exciting time because the new urbanists have been around for 40 years, starting with Seaside, and a lot of these regulatory barriers have started to shift.
Right.
The narrative is starting to shift. I read a book to my kid, just a random kid's book, and it mentioned like walkable neighborhood, nothing to do about urbanism, but like you would not have seen that 10 years ago. Talking about walkable neighborhood now, you could walk to the store or their school or something. So it's starting to make its way into culture too. So it's starting to make its way into policy. People, even boomers my parents are an example. They're starting to even be like, oh, that's kind of an interesting concept. It's not just, people living on top of each other, blah, blah, blah. There's a real benefit to all this. Environmentalists, I think, in some degrees, are starting to come around realizing, well, if you want a sustainable city, you build a walkable city. LEED certifications, all that, that's kind of like whatever. Walkable cities is how you build a sustainable city. And so I think there's a lot of positive momentum. At the same time, we are still in the early innings. Like if you're on like early majority or the innovator side. And so I think the more organizations across the country the more regardless of what, if you could be an architect, you could be a builder, you could be a developer, you could be an advocacy organization. All of those are absolute media, like super important to start shifting the conversation across politics, finances, and culture. And so even just educating people on social media, like what you guys are doing on YouTube, on TikTok, whatever it is, that's great because you're educating people. Organizing, and of course, this is not something you would do what's cool about social media is you can reach people across the country or world, really. And then in your local community in New York City, in your Astoria neighborhood, I mean, you can organize, you can watch city council meetings or planning commission meetings, you could go up and speak. Like, and I think young people speaking is powerful, because most people don't, because you're busy, you don't even know you can do it. And so I think showing up at some of these things, these planning commission meetings, city council meetings, getting some of your friends to come, and then growing the movement from there could be pretty cool. And just like I said about 50 people yelling is really powerful. If you had 50 people speaking on behalf of something, like that is so rare. That's inspiring, and that will shift city councilors and planning commissioners. Like it 100% will, when they see that there's some support for something and passion behind it. So it's surprisingly, even though things are really hard, it's actually easier to make a difference than I would have thought even 5 years ago.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, we started just trying to figure out how we could do something, and we weren't even thinking about it from, I know you mentioned like, in terms of sustainability, when we thought about it, we were just like, we're kind of, fed up with the traffic and we enjoy walking the walking city. So we thought that that would be good because it encourages community development and can allow us to have courtyards, green spaces, and things of that nature. But it does also align with a lot of the sustainability initiatives that are happening because walkable cities are going to create less carbon emissions because there's not going to be as much of a need for cars. So it's really a thing that if enough people get behind, like you were talking about how we're more on the innovator side, if enough people get behind it, I think there can be a real tangible difference to the United States in the next couple of decades.
I completely agree.
Yeah. And one of the things that I found super interesting about Townsend was, I know you mentioned there were some local coffee shops instead of Starbucks and a lot of these corporate chains. And I think that that's honestly one of the most important things because with a lot of authentic food and good restaurants being zoned out of existence due to people not wanting to go there as much as the corporate food that they're used to, it becomes more corporate. And a lot of these restaurants, they're not good for you. I mean, the food's coming out of microwave bags and keeping American unhealthy. And we have such a big problem with the lack of walkability contributing to obesity and just a very unhealthy country. So I think that's one of the most important things as well.
Yeah, I think it has a profound effect on our health. I mean, you even talked about walkability, not only the health of walking, and it's something like, I'll get the statistic wrong, but it's not even 10,000 steps a day. I think it's like 7,000 steps a day. Reduces all-cause mortality by like, I don't know, 40% or something insane. And then all the information starting to come out about the importance of just natural sunlight, and that's like scientifically backed. Well, guess what you're getting when you're walking? Sunlight. I mean, there's all these little downstream effects. And I think human health, if you probably saw this on our Apollo website, health is a really critical part of how we think about our buildings and our architecture. Because once again, it is the human habitat. If you've got a bad habitat, the people in it are going to be sick, just like an animal.
Yeah. And it's especially prevalent in a lot of European cities. I know that a lot of cities in Italy, I mean, their food it's not like particularly the healthy. I mean, they're eating so much olive oil and bread, but they're living longer and they're healthy. And I think that is just because they're able to get outside and walk.
Yeah, they can smoke packs of cigarettes and still live longer than us,
because it's insane.
They're just healthier, and they can when you're healthy, you can actually handle toxins and all kinds of other things better. But yeah, their food's far less toxic and all that.
Yeah, I think your body, I guess, learns to cleanse itself of that and of the negative things that are coming in to a better degree than if you were to, sit inside, not get any fresh air, not get the sunlight, and just, sit in the laptop all day at home.
Yeah.
So I have a list of questions here. Yeah, so, and like we were talking about the local businesses, so walkability and the businesses are one thing, but there's also kind of the cultural gravity around everything and that natural orbit of how foot traffic comes in and out. So how do you think people from other cities are going to contribute to coming into Townsend in terms of supporting the restaurants and the businesses in there?
I think if you, and I think downtown Edmond, where this is located, will just become increasingly, my hope and what we're trying to work towards is just increasingly become a destination. And what I mean by that is, rather than saying, not that you're going to know any of the restaurants there's this restaurant called The Mule. Rather than saying, hey, let's go to The Mule, it's let's go to downtown Edmond. And then maybe you end up at The Mule, and maybe you walk around and you go this and you do that. And that's a completely different thing when you've created a destination that people just want to come to and visitors just want to be in, whether they're staying in a hotel there or going up there for an evening or a Saturday. And so that's what I would say. Townsend's just this 1 acre site. It can't change the whole thing, but I think it absolutely contributes to the fabric and the vibrancy and kind of sets a new standard of what's possible with new construction, not just adaptive reuse, which is great, but there's a lot of, we need actually new construction too, contributing to placemaking and walkability. And so the actual like townhomes and the workspace, a lot of that will probably be mainly for people that live there, but that's cool too. There's nothing wrong with that. And then hopefully that can precipitate more entertainment and other things around in downtown Edmond.
Yeah, and that is how you build that soul of a neighborhood, when the people that live there are all coming together in the community, whether it's going to the park, going to the office spaces, things of that nature. And I do find it interesting that you say, oh, people will be like, let's come to downtown Edmond. I think that's a really fascinating thing, instead of just focusing on one place. I know in my suburb, there's like a little downtown area, but there's probably like 2 restaurants. So it's like, we wouldn't be like, let's go downtown here. We would be, let's go to this restaurant or this restaurant. But when you have a nice community with all these different things, you can go to a coffee shop and you can go to a restaurant, and then you can go to a local bar, get drinks after that. It gives you something to do, and it creates that soul.
Yeah, and just like take a stroll, like that's what I'm excited about where we're built. It's like, hey, you want to take a break from work, or you just ate lunch, just take a stroll around the park, around the downtown, and come back to work. Yeah. Versus what are you going to do in an office park? I mean, there's technically sidewalks everywhere. Once again, if there's nothing to walk to and it's not beautiful and it's not safe feeling, no one's going to walk.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's something to be said for economic development too. I mean, you had mentioned hotels, people coming to stay in, or just finding a restaurant after deciding to come to downtown Edmond, or really anywhere, right? There's so many businesses that feed into this ecosystem. They create jobs, they create tourism. And by having smaller walkable destinations, wherever they are, whether it's the Mule that you mentioned, right, or the cinema, or a museum, anything, having these buildings that are pulling people in creates economic development and will bring more people in because of more jobs and more opportunities. And showing these statistics to city councils could be something that really gets people on board with the idea of rezoning or with the idea of walkable neighborhoods, giving concrete statistics on how they help develop the local economy.
Yeah, that seems like a very winning conversation in terms of like left and right. Everyone loves local businesses. Like I have yet to like really meet a group of people that's like, screw the local businesses. That's a pretty winning topic, and you're completely right that these types of neighborhoods are what enable the local businesses. And then on top of it, in terms of statistics, the recirculation of dollars within a community, because it's a local business and the ownership is there and the investors are there, whatever it is, versus a chain, you might have it employs a few people, but all the profits get funneled somewhere else, right, and kind of taken out of your community.
And I think the same thing goes for the medium developers, right? If you're living in the community, you have more incentive to spend your money at those businesses and keep circulating the dollar where you are. And that creates better spaces for families because they can own real estate, they could own properties, and they could contribute to their own community. They have a vested interest in seeing it succeed rather than a detached, sort of careless approach that most renters have because they don't have a stake in the community.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was kind of wondering also, what metrics could you use to measure the success of Townsend and the people coming in and out? Would that be foot traffic or sales from the restaurants and coffee shops, or how would you measure that?
That's really interesting. I was talking to a friend about the idea of like, what was it? He called it dwelling time like how many minutes are people staying in downtown Edmond when they come, and you want to increase dwelling time essentially. And it's like hard to measure because if they're at Townsend or Apollo or whatever it is, I mean, they're there, but like how many more minutes in aggregate across everyone are you just like more total minutes of people being in downtown Edmond? If you could measure that, that would be pretty incredible. And Townsend would be a huge contributor because there's a lack of office space. So then getting people there, a bunch of young professionals that are officing there, they're bringing clients there. That's a lot of extra dwell time, to add vibrancy, to add, to the restaurants and local businesses and all of that.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think that social media has changed the role of architecture firms in terms of like shaping community sentiment and developing local pride? Because I know that if you look, I mean, you mentioned that Building Culture has a podcast, and I feel like 10, 15 years ago, architecture firm having a podcast would be so unusual, but now it's super interesting to see how online and the media has shaped this type of thing. So how do you think it's changed it?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like social media and technology. You can see a bunch of negative consequences, and how much, I don't know, the average team spends almost 5 hours a day on social media or something. But there's also incredible positive things to it too. And that I think it really democratizes influence and culture where just anyone, you guys can just start a podcast. I can start a podcast.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean anyone will listen to it per se, but at the same time, if you keep at it and you grow and you become someone in your community, I'd much rather see a bunch of small local influencers than like giant national influencers. Like that's more interesting to me, of being someone in your community with a voice that people listen to, and shape things. And so I think that's really cool about social media. And I would say we haven't even come close to taking full advantage of it. The podcast has been a surprising success for me, not because there is a giant audience, but it's a decent audience for being a niche podcast. Right. And I can't believe how many conversations it's opened up, how many people will listen to something and be like, oh, wow, and pass it on to a friend. It's opened opportunities for me. And it's definitely shaped people's minds and opinions, and that's pretty cool. So it's something I want to continually lean into, and especially when there's a body of work behind it, when we're building cool stuff. Yeah. That helps too, I think, and so I think architects and builders and developers have a really good opportunity to do that and tell the story and tell people why and all of these other things.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. And a point that I want to touch on was you mentioned that average teen spends 5 hours on social media or whatnot, and it's a huge issue. And I think that honestly, a lot of that issue is not having access to these local communities, because I know that there's so many statistics. I can't name off the top of my head exactly, but younger people, Gen Z, millennials, feel that they lack communities that a lot of the older generations had. And I think that projects like yours are a way to frankly get people off social media and get them together in real life, because it gives them something to do and a way to bond and form real connections with their neighborhood.
I think you're spot on. Like, it's not just the social media company's fault or problem or something like that. It's like, well, what else are you supposed to do? I mean, I think before the social media, it was probably people were spending 5 hours a day watching TV, It's just kind of shifted, because if you're a kid and you're not 16 years old yet and don't have a license, and you live in 98% of America, to do anything, your mom or dad has to drive you somewhere. That means it has to be scheduled. They have to be free. They have to not be working. They have to be able to come and schedule it and pick you up. And you can't have a life, really, that's not planned and organized and prescribed. And I think just this organic childhood and a free range kids, are really important. I agree that unless you actually provide people an alternative, you can't just get people off social media. What are they going to do? Sit and read a book? I mean, that sounds great, and I would wish people read more, I guess. But I think you're right. Like, you need a coherent community to be a part of.
Yeah. And the issue with social media is that it's probably a lot more toxic than watching TV was, and it can allow teenagers and kids to stumble down the wrong hole or whatever it may be, and get them to have bad ideas or just put them in negative states of mental health. I know you mentioned before you have a license, you have to wait for your parents. I remember that so clearly when I was growing up in the suburbs, before I was able to drive, it was like, I mean, I would literally go and just bike for like 45 minutes just to get to my friend's house because there was nothing I could do. I mean, my parents were at work, and yeah, it sucked.
I did that too. And
Yeah.
it's interesting, like the suburbs I grew up in, I kind of say it was still, I say it was still kind of the ideal of the suburb, and that like we were an hour outside of downtown Houston, and there was a single family detached neighborhood, but then there was like all kinds of woods around and bayou and all that. And so when I was growing up,
Yeah.
we would go off on our bikes for hours at a time. We explore in the woods,
Yeah.
but have quite a bit of fun. By the time I came back from college, there was no land left. It was just all concrete sprawl. And so if I'd grown up at that time, I'd have been utterly miserable.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a lot of very, very deep issues like this. And I think there's a real problem because then the automatic default there comes to kids just going on their iPads, going on their computers, and not really experiencing real life in the way that they should be. So I guess that the ultimate goal for us is to try to bring more communities like that and save younger generations from going down paths that they wouldn't have had to go down 20 years ago because it's not their fault. I mean, you can't even blame them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
Angela,
guess,
yeah.
just to wrap things up, how do you see your project Townsend impacting other projects across the country, and where do you see America as a whole in like 10, 20, 30 years with increased support for urbanism and increased support for walkable projects?
It's been kind of overwhelming to see just once again this little project in Oklahoma
Right.
that most people have never been to Oklahoma or thought about Oklahoma. And if you look at just the kind of the social media response, and not just from random people, although also from random people, but like real estate developers and people with influence, they're overwhelmingly positive. And I think it's just because it's like, whoa, you can do this today. And it's like, yeah, I mean, it is really hard. And I wouldn't be like, yeah, it's so easy. I'm like, it is really freaking hard, but it can be done. And so that's like, I almost see it as like a proof of concept of like, this can be done. This is the type of thing we should be fighting for. We need, and then use kind of actually building things as a platform to talk about the kinds of things that need to change so that more people can do this. Because I'm once again about empowering other small and medium developers over the long run. I don't want to grow a giant national construction and real estate company that can go and design and build and develop in New York City and Chicago and Atlanta. I'm not saying I'd never partner with anyone outside of state. I just mean I really want to keep my work local, but have a national influence, if that makes sense. And then other people can do that. And so like, I think as we start to get the regulatory barriers out of the way, as people start to care about these type of communities, we need better schooling and better architecture schools out there that are teaching how to do good urban design and good architecture. There's a few out there, but honestly, not very many. You need small and medium developers, and you need some financing mechanisms to help fund these things and not be so difficult, which there's a lot of attention on this. So I'm really excited. It's not about like us being able to do the only projects. Like, I hope this is the first of many that we do, and the first of many that hundreds and thousands of other people do across the country, which then just, increases the acceleration of the snowball effect. So.
Yeah. And I think that essentially wraps up what we were talking about. And I 100% agree with you that I think that it can create the same effect in other communities because social media is such a powerful tool to scale things, and other people are going to see that. But yeah, I mean, with that, I think that's everything. And thank you so much for coming on here and talking to us and telling us about Townsend. I hope that there's more developments like this that come in the future. And our goal is to advocate for things of that nature.